This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
Across South African schools, violence, bullying and vandalism are turning classrooms into battlegrounds. Teachers, caretakers and learners are all facing daily trauma that often goes unseen and unreported. A recent study at the Durban schools uncovered these realities, and schools in the Western Cape are no different. We'll explore now what is certainly driving the crisis and what can be done to restore safety and discipline in our schools with a panel of guests. We welcoming now Nomusa, Cembi, the national spokesperson for the South African the South African Democratic Teachers Union, SADTU. Also Professor Sigamoney, Naicker, who lectured in specialized education in UWC's Department of Educational Psychology, on the line with us. We're hoping a representative from the Department of Basic Education, Terence Kala, will join us in just a bit. But let's get certainly going with our discussion here this morning. And let's start off with an account from a high school teacher, and please note that we have changed the teacher's voice to protect their identity.
Assalamu alaikum. I teach grade 8 and 9, and one of the biggest problems I believe that our schools are facing is discipline and the lack of accountability when it comes to learner unruliness, disrespect and learner violence. There are two incidents that happened in my very short career. The first one was a fight between two boys, and it happened with a slight disagreement, and one of the boys was extremely big. He was physically much bigger than me and the other boys. He got so upset and so aggressive that he lunged towards another boy, a much smaller boy, and started choking him. And as a small teacher, regardless of my stature, he was extremely big. I physically couldn't pull him off, and he was so aggressive, there was just so much rage on him that he literally couldn't see anything and didn't listen to anything. I had to shout for another teacher. I had to shout for the boys to get another teacher, one of the male teachers from the other class, and one of the teachers opposite me actually heard me shouting and the learner shouting and came in and tried to assist, but it took a male teacher to take him off the boy. That was the first one. The second one that I experienced recently was two girls fighting, and it also started off with a slight disagreement. One of the learners was handing out a worksheet and didn't give the other learner, and she got so upset that started a physical brawl between the learners, and I tried to physically take them apart, and in doing so one of the learners punched me in the face. But both those examples, the reason why it stood out to me wasn't because of the physical fight necessarily, it was the aggression behind it and what caused it, like the simplicity of what caused that aggression, and also how quickly it started and how little power I had as a teacher in those moments trying to stop the learners.
So those are, in the account certainly of a teacher, in regards to experiences in the high school and how fighting and violence, is very difficult to manage, particularly not just for teachers that aren't physically able to restrain, but also to impose, a particular, sense of discipline within the schooling environment. So let's get into our conversation, and I want to start off with you, Professor Sigamoney Naicker. Thank you very much for your time. Of course, you did a lot of work in specialized education and in psychology, education psychology, as it were. And we can look. There are so many areas with which to start, but let's deal with the issue of what the typical current learning environment is for the average school that is characterized by high population numbers within the classroom, a lack of sufficient resources, and that breeding, of course, a bigger set of issues. Describe for us, please, what typically teachers are facing at the moment. Good morning.
Good morning. And good morning to all your viewers, and good morning to Nomusa. I got the name right.
That's correct.
Yeah, so, this is a very important topic. And, I'm glad that you are discussing it, because I think it's ignored in South Africa. And I'll explain that later on. But the teachers in working class communities have high teacher learner ratios. Obviously, the social fabric of society is in decay across the Western Cape and across the country, in a sense. So, I think that there's enormous pressure on teachers. But I just want to alert you to one bit of research. Um, Paul Willis in the UK did some research on working class children. We all know that working class children dominate the education environment in the Western Cape and in South Africa. We have more working class people than we have middle class people. And Paul Willis' study found that these children form a counterculture. They form they create an anti-establishment culture in their schools and where they live. Because of reasons that I will explain later. But what we haven't done in South Africa is we haven't tried to understand poor learners. We haven't tried to understand where poor learners come from and how that should influence the pedagogy when we interact with the children at ECD centers firstly and in the foundation phase. I think we have a big problem in South Africa. We are following colonial models of education that doesn't work here. We need to take care of our children in the townships. If we don't do that, we run the risk of a very volatile, unstable society in the future. So I'm glad that you are raising this issue and discussing this, because it's really not about the learner. It is about the system. The system is too detached from the reality of poor people.
Okay,
Let me stop there.
before I bring Nomusa into the discussion, let me just ask a follow-up on what that means. So if we're saying the system, how do we understand that without being abstract about it? That the reality is that there are kids that come from very troubled homes and communities that, certainly are, infused with, environmental factors, such as drugs, violence, gang violence, etc. And then oftentimes when there isn't, a place to be able to deal with that energy and that anger, etc., that a lot of what happens within the home and within society, within communities, then spills over into the classroom, and that then is, that particular cycle continues. And as we heard from that teacher in that voice note there, that you have scenarios where that level of violence is almost so blinding that when it occurs within the school environment, it's really almost, let's call it an environmental factor that is now being brought within the classroom, and that is something that teachers are not equipped to handle. They've gone to university to learn how to teach, but now they're having to try and police, what are these environmental factors, if we want to be abstract about it, that is beyond certainly their control.
Okay, so let me say to you that I spent many years in the system, and when I left the system, I wrote a book called, I think we spoke about this book, it's called Education in the Working Class, Is There Hope for an Inclusive System? And in that book, because I grew up working class and I saw what was happening in the system, I realized that many of our people in education have got it wrong in South Africa. We're following a system that privileges the elite, right? And it reproduces social inequality at a massive scale. So the education system is actually an engine of inequality. And for so many years, what have we done for the children in the townships? Let me just point out, to be fair, we have a system in the Western Cape that reproduces inequality. Look at the farms. Look at the children on the wine farms. Many of them are 18 and 19. They are working on those farms, and they are doing what their ancestors did 200 years ago Nobody says a word. The violence in Lavender Hill, in Nyanga, in Kailicha, in Mitchell's Plain, in Hanover Park, there are 50 children in those classrooms. We've done nothing about it. But let me be fair. There are some people in the Western Cape Education Department, individuals I'm talking about, like Neville Goliath, a Dr. Kemp, and some other individuals. We have some excellent programs, and the School of Courage in Wynberg is a very good example of taking care of poor children or children who are struggling. But I must say, at a systems level, we got it wrong. We can't rely on individuals and individual enthusiasm and individual professionalism to solve the problems. We need a systemic solution. How long are we talking about the children in Hanover Park? How long are we talking about the children in Lavender Hill? How long are we talking about the children in Menenberg? I think it just doesn't make sense to me. So when you invited me to this program this morning, I knew what I was going to say. I've written about this. I've spoken about the inequalities. Let me just give you a very practical example. Rondebosch and Delft. More children, young boys die before the age of 30 because they join gangs in Hanover Park and Delft. And in Rondebosch, they become CAs and they become lawyers and doctors and so on. That's been happening for 100 years. In the democracy, it continues to happen. And nobody says a word. So I'm glad you're starting this conversation. And I think that the bureaucrats in the education system are politicized and can't think outside the box. Because in the many years that I've been in the Western Cape, attending very senior meetings, I've never seen a concept document on the social problems in the Western Cape. I've never seen or be part of a constructive discussion about how to address this instability. It reminds me of the traffic in the Western Cape. There are no solutions.
All right, let me go to Nomusa Cembi, and thank you very much for your patience. National spokesperson with the South African Democratic Teachers Union. Is it true that there isn't much, much like Professor Naicker is lamenting, that there isn't much of a plan, or at least a understanding, an acknowledgement of the societal, not just challenges, but the fundamentals that drive those challenges, the inequality, the poverty, the lack of development, the lack of support, etc. Are those the big sticking points for why we see classrooms becoming, undone in the way that it is, threatening the quality of teaching and also the well-being of those teachers that you represent? Good morning.
Good morning, and good morning to your listeners, and good morning to Professor Naicker. Yes, I would say, we say a school reflects the community where it comes from. So if you are in a situation where a community, there's a lot of crime, there's a lot of gangsterism, and there's a lot of unemployment and all that, that will be reflected in the school. You will see those things happening in the school. Unfortunately, the way our schools are designed, we have, we have the curriculum, we have annual teaching plans, we have all these things, and we have to finish certain things by certain times and all. It's done in such a way that it doesn't look at the contextual factors as to where you are and all. What are the circumstances in where you come from. All schools have got to perform in a same manner. Our system does not take into account the contextual factors as to the environment where the learners come from. So our system treats it says, a child in the suburbs should perform exactly as the child in the townships. and in the farms or in the rural areas, without necessarily looking at what the resources that are there, the social factors in the area, because those really they do affect how schools perform. You find in an area that is full of gangsterism, that will be in the school. In an area that is poverty stricken, learners in the school will be affected. They may not turn up, they may not attend school as much as they would like to, because they are hungry, they cannot make it to school, or there's no money for transport or whatever to take them to schools. But our system at the end of the day wants children to perform in them. They have one system that they look to for performance of learners. We feel at sometimes it is unfair, because learners come from different backgrounds, and those backgrounds are critical in their performance at school.
And what is that, due to the broader psychology of education, Prof? This is, of course, in many parts, its fundamentals is about the ability to absorb what's being taught. But if the teachers are already to begin with, on uneven ground in terms of learner discipline, classroom numbers, and then also the learning and teaching resources that often would be lacking, the state of some of the classrooms that are oftentimes being vandalized by, again, those social challenges within our society, in our communities, etc. What does that do for the qualitative teaching that I suppose now is diluted or is less evident? Prof? I think your mic might be muted, Prof.
Sorry, yeah. So Nelson Mandela, Steve Biko, Imam Arun, Neville Alexander, all these people who made so much of sacrifices for our society said that education is the poor man's strongest weapon to liberate oneself. But we come from a struggle in our country. We are not abstracted from any struggles. We understand that. So, but we forget, and we have a technical, mechanical education system like the one that they have in the UK and the US, where they reproduce inequality on a massive scale. We have followed the example, but we are not like them. We come from a struggle in this country. And so we can't dismiss this problem. We have to address it. Let me give you a very practical example. In January every year, you have a big function for the richest kids in the country who get results in the premier's residences, in the mayor's office or wherever, right, across the country. But nobody celebrates working class children. And you have to ask yourself the question. I'm not saying it's easy to get all distinctions and these wonderful passes people get, but it must be a struggle if you lived in Khayelitsha to get to pass matric. And the problem is this: in Rondebosch and all these rich areas, people have role models. Their uncles and their aunts are doctors and lawyers and so on. So they have a vision about where they're going to. But in Khayelitsha, education is not working for many of the uncles and aunts and siblings and so on. But we don't celebrate the success in those townships. What it tells you is that only certain people are important in this current 21st century South Africa, and they are the rich people. I mean, when I used to drive in Khayelitsha, I should see a billboard of a beer advert. right? I always regard myself as a working class person. I enjoyed social mobility and education and so on, but I have a working class consciousness. And when I see that billboard, I can understand the pain of the parents and grandparents in Khayelitsha and Lavendale and Mitchell's Plain and so on, because alcohol is a major problem. No one says anything about this. Look at the bets, the Hollywood bets that appears on television every day. Poor people gamble. I know it in the townships because I grew up in a place where the drugs, alcohol, and all these things. And I can tell you one thing. That's the reason why I wrote my book, is because I wanted the education authorities to understand that we're not taking care of our people. Are poor people lesser people? That's colonial thinking. So I asked somebody once, after I wrote my book, I asked a professor in India, asked him, how is it that people can't see this thing? Because it's so rampant and in your face. He said to me, it's a colonial thinking. So us black people, and we become colonials when we see our own people suffer and we are not affected by it. Let me stop there.
You used the India example. I want to just, stay with how we compare to other countries, for instance, right? You have countries with a similar subset of challenges like ours, like I'll throw Nigeria, India, Brazil in there, right? And South Africa, of course, does have free and compulsory basic education from grades R to 9. That is what I know there's some that take issue with CAPS as a curriculum, but CAPS is understood to be a strong policy framework as a curriculum. Government spends about 6% of the GDP on education, though there are very poor literacy and numeracy outcomes. There are disparities, of course, between former Model C schools and private schools and these township and rural schools that we're referring to. The teacher quality that is being impaired by challenges within the classroom. There's overcrowded classrooms, etc. There's also language instruction transitions, from English home language and other languages, etc. In India, for instance, there's massive inequality in education access and quality. There's some multilingual challenges, of course. There's also a huge private school sector. Some successful large-scale programs like midday meals and school enrollment drives have been celebrated as a success of the education system in India. There's a strong emphasis on STEM and exams in the upper grades. Nigeria is largely underfunded, large disparities that exist between urban and the rural areas. There's a lot of similarities with South Africa and Kenya, where there's large classroom sizes and constraints within public schools and pressure on the system from population growth, etc. And then also concerns about high enrollment rates at primary level, but then they dwindle along the line. And so there are very similarities, of course, between these different nations. And when we throw violence into the mix there, in South Africa, the experience is more notable. For instance, if you look at Nigeria, yes, there's insurgency and Boko Haram, but that is slightly different in nature compared to the violence that we see, for instance, on the Cape Flats. And so, Nomusa, just to ask you, in terms of that comparisons that I'm drawing between South Africa and other parts of the world, how convinced are you that the problems that we have here can be overcome? That if we address the societal issues, that naturally that will translate into a better working, functional classroom.
Yes, you made a comparison with those countries, but we should. South Africa is unique in that we come from a system of apartheid where where education was used to suppress the majority and the majority of South Africans were receiving poor quality education. There was a system for which was unequal, based on one's race. So even though we are saying we are using 6% of GDP towards education, the inequalities that were created by the apartheid systems were so huge that we are still grappling with those equalities even now as we speak. The issue of some teachers not really being properly qualified has got to do with the history, with where we come from. Even the teacher training at that time, our teachers were not, black teachers were not trained the way other teachers, white teachers were trained. The training was different. And even the emphasis on STEM subjects, the apartheid system was meant to create people who would just be just workers. There was no emphasis on that. And so now we are still, and it's education, it's something that you cannot turn overnight. Yes, one can say we're 30 years into this new democracy, but the effects of apartheid, they will take time, because education that doesn't change overnight. It takes time for education to change. So we cannot say we can compare effectively with these countries, because they did not undergo or suffer what we suffered in South Africa.
And so, using that foundation, then, with the stark levels of inequality and the institutional challenges that our education system so does face, there's been, I suppose, some shifting patterns in criminality and what's happening within our communities, and the underdevelopment that Prof. Naicker, you've been highlighting as a real liability to the functional classroom. Because I can almost hear someone say, oh, stop talking about apartheid, this, that, and the other. And I think that's, I don't want to be disrespectful, but I think, there's a very relevant point that Nomusa has just made about, the uniqueness about the South African challenge. How then do we find a way, given the current set of challenges that we face, how do we establish discipline in the classroom? We have a big challenge here in that, if the values are absent in the home, then how do you expect those values to find a presence, of course, in the classroom? And so their teachers then are forced to do more than just teaching. They're having to contend with a set of challenges that holds them back in providing the sort of qualitative learner at the end of the academic year. So given your work, Prof. Naicker, that you've done in assessing these challenges, is there a codified way to re-establish values and discipline within the classroom?
Well, as Nomusa says, we're in for the long haul, but we need to make a start. And I agree with Nomusa about the historical challenges we face. It's an enormous challenge. It's really an enormous challenge. But to that point, and to answer your question, recently I've been to a poor area, very poor area, and I've been to a few schools, and then I noticed that those schools were located in a township environment, and then nearby there was a established town. So when you go through the Western Cape, you'll find a church, you'll find a bottle store, and those are the characteristics of the townships in the Western Cape, of the towns in the Western Cape. And then you have an underdeveloped area and a developed area. And 30 years into the democracy, the the place hasn't changed. There is so much of poverty where people come in, they work at the KFC or they work at Checkers, and they leave the children at 10 o'clock in the morning. They come home at 10 o'clock at night. Whilst the people in the developed cities, they are with their children, they have caregivers, they are supported and so on. South African society is very unequal. To resolve this, as Nomusa pointed out, it is also a societal contextual problem. So we need a more compassionate public in South Africa. We need a compassionate bureaucracy. We need compassionate politicians who care about humanity, who love children, and who want a better society for all. We have to change the way we think about education, because education has lost its essence. It has become a commodity. And we need to bring humanity into education. Government needs to invest the majority of the education budget on ECD. You're not going to solve this problem tomorrow, as Nomusa says. So in ECD, for example, you can't have a colonial curriculum. You need to have a curriculum that understands these societies, what happens in these societies, and what are the implications for pedagogy. The program in ECD must focus on supporting and giving the child love, but also educating children in literacy and numeracy. We can't pay our practitioners peanuts. We can't invest in so many curriculum programs in the secondary phase when we really need the investment in ECD. And we can't have a colonial ECD. We can't rely on Vygotsky and Piaget and all those people. We can take the best out of them and develop a pedagogy that's based on the South African context. That's number one. Number two, your foundation phase. If a child comes from Lavender Hill, if a child comes from Nyanga, the most violent places in the world, what pedagogy do you use in ECD and in the foundation phase? You can't use a colonial pedagogy. CAPS is a colonial curriculum. It doesn't understand what happens in Delft. It doesn't understand what happens in Nyanga. We need to rethink the pedagogy so we build resilience in children who come from gangster-afflicted environments, domestic abuse, drugs, alcohol. How do we create a pedagogy that reveals a relationship between the lived reality of children and the expectations of a universal curriculum? That's the research agenda South Africa must embark on, or we're wasting our time. It's a pity that the teacher had to be anonymous to explain those problems she encountered. I mean, she herself will need some help, psychological help, to be put through those kind of experiences. We can't, I must tell you, I've been in the system for too long. We have a colonial system in South Africa. And as Nomusa says, we are different from other countries. I mean, a lot of these countries have been colonial, they've been colonized as well. But we know what damage can be caused to people through education. Education can be a tool for liberation, or it can be a tool for oppression. And what we have now at the moment is a tool for oppression. Education is a tool for oppression. The education system is an engine of inequality. I'll stop there.
Well, we actually have to round it up there, and I think that's an important point to then consider when we apply our minds to the systemic challenges that we face in education. And of course, a radio program may not materially move things, but we hope it will, in some way or the other, massage the conversation, to reshape our thinking about the challenges that we're confronted with, that it's not just about, gang warfare or this, that, and the other, that there are, levels to this problem, then crisis that we have, and there's lots of ground to cover on that front. Thank you very much, Prof. Naicker, for your time this morning. Professor Sigamoney Naicker, who lectured in specialized education at the University of the Western Cape's Department of Educational Psychology. Also, Nomusa, Cembi, thank you very much for your time, the national spokesperson for the South African Democratic Teachers Union, SADTU.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.